Well, I was just over at the Clinton Library, and I feel like I should have put on an Oscar de la Renta gown and come out with like dramatic flair. But anyway, this is going to have to work. Well, thank you very much. This is exciting. Wasn't that like an amazing entrance? Should I have done like a kind of a thing like this or whatever? I don't know. Anyway, so well, first of all, this is really cool. And I went to the library. It was spectacular. I had probably the best meal I've probably ever had in my life last night at the Capitol Hotel. Got to run down along the river today. It was fantastic. So very big fan of Little Rock, Arkansas. First of all, I want to thank the Clinton School of Public Service and Nikolai DePippa. I just love saying that, Nikolai DePippa, who's a very cool guy and very capable, and I'm so glad. I had a wonderful tour by Bob G., a volunteer at the library, who took me through. Do you all know him? He's a volunteer in a lot of places, but he is spectacular. And I want to thank everyone for having me here, for Susan Elder, who's a friend and supporter who I think was the person that made the introduction here. And above all, I want to say thank you to everybody here who is associated with the military. And I see some people in uniform. It's something that, when I grew up, it's a very easy thing to do. We don't do it enough, and we don't show it enough. But my father used to remind me when I was a kid that I was one of those people that didn't miss a meal or hear a shot fired in anger, and I needed to reach out and shake the hand whenever possible, those who have. So if we can recognize all of you here who have either served in uniform or are in uniform now, and in the service now, that would be very And that isn't to say that the dependents and rather the spouses aren't just as important in that world. And my mother was a very active Army spouse. So, well, we're talking about the Pattons today a little bit. I'm going to talk about a book called Growing Up Patton that I wrote last year, and it focuses on two George Pattons. There's actually four. I think there was and everybody, there's a lot of people that love my grandfather. There's a few people that don't like him very much. And the same goes for my father, and the same goes for everyone else in our family. It's really a batch of equal opportunity offenders, I guess you would call us. There was actually someone that left that was a visitor at our home one time. I'm already off on a tangent and I haven't even started. But there was someone that, an anonymous visitor, maybe 60 or 70 years ago, I was actually, probably about the time I was a little kid, came to visit our home in Massachusetts. And my mother found a little poem stuffed inside a dictionary or a book after this weekend was over. And she doesn't know who wrote it, but there was a little poem about the four Georges. At that point, there were actually five, but I think at the time this was written, there were only four Georges. And it said something like, George the First is very vile, George the Second viler, no one living ever heard any good of George the Third. With George the Fourth, the throne ascended, heaven be praised, the Georges ended. So my brother was the fifth, actually, so it must have predated him because he's a lovely guy. But anyway, so let's dive into this comparison. As Tracy said so eloquently, I do have the two that I'm focusing on. My grandfather from World War II and World War I, and my dad from Korea and Vietnam. I pay homage to them both because I have a little gold cross that survived 4 wars, actually, around their necks. They were only shot once each, so... Actually, my father was shot twice. He just didn't have time to put in for the Purple Heart in his hand. But... So we'll dive right in for a little bit of a comparison of these two Georges that I'm going to focus on. In the motion picture Patton, which came out when I was 5, in about 1970, imagine many of you have seen it. It was certainly my first impression of my grandfather, and everyone thought that I was related to George C. Scott. So do the math on that. That was tricky. But so there's a wonderful scene toward the end of the movie, the height of the Battle of Bulge, and George C. Scott's Patton gets some bad news about lack of air cover and bad weather, and he's in his 3rd Army Staff Headquarters, and he's staying next to his Lieutenant Colonel Codman, who was his aide, and he hears this bad news, and he just blows his top in front of the entire staff, and he says, damn it, or he said a few things like that. He said, we're going to attack all night, we're going to attack in the morning, and if we're not victorious, let no man come back alive. In that very George C. Scott towering voice. His aide, Lieutenant, and he sort of glared at his staff, in the movie. So his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Codman, whispered in his ear, and he said, "You know something, General?" He said, sometimes the men can't tell when you're acting and when you're not. And then Scott's Patton had the classic response, "Codman, it is important for them to know. It's only important for me to know." So, now we jump ahead. Now again, that's the Hollywood version, but it rings true. Then we jump ahead. to 1971. This is one of the only things I'm going to read from the book, because I'm not Nelson Mandela or Bill Clinton as far as an orator goes. But so 1971, my father's the assistant commandant of the armor school in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And he's driving. It's a snowy mid-November day, and I think he was going to a ceremony for Zachary Taylor, who's buried near Fort Knox, the president. And he's coming back with his chaplain, this man named Chaplain Myers, and there's a whole section of this book on spiritual influences of my father, which I think is pretty strong. It's one of my favorite parts. And they're driving back, and it's a snowy day. It hadn't been that much snow in November since then, but on this day there was. So I'm going to read a little piece, and here's how Chaplain Myers remembers it. They were driving back, and my father spotted a soldier walking back to base, hitchhiking in his summer uniform in the snow. And here's how Chaplain Myers remembers what happened next. Apologies for the slightly salty language, but I think we should just be genuine here. "Stop the goddamn car," said General Patton. My dad was a 1-star at the time. He beckoned the young soldier inside and yelled, "Soldier, do you know how cold it is out there? What are you doing?" "Well, I'm on my way to hock my wedding ring, sir, so I can buy Thanksgiving dinner for my family," the soldier said. "Let me see that damn ring," said the general. It was just a cheap-looking thing. He turned to Chaplain Myers. "What do you think, Myers? What do you think this is worth?" "I don't know, sir. I'm not a pawnbroker." Patton turned back to the soldier. "Why aren't you wearing your winter uniform?" he asked. The soldier replied that every time he visited the supply room, it was closed. Patton gazed at him for a minute. "This is my dad." "Do you know who I am, soldier?" he asked. "No, sir, said the soldier, but I think you're some kind of general." "Well, you're about to find out what kind of general I am," Patton said. "Take me to your headquarters. I want to talk to your commander right now." When they arrived, the soldier spotted Patton's uniform and shouted attention as he and the rest of the group walked up the stairs. The commander was a lieutenant colonel, and he looked terrified. "At ease," Patton said. He pointed to the soldier. "You see this poor, shivering SOB," or words to that effect? "Yes, I see him," said the commander. "He's never been issued winter clothing. By 1600 hours, I want him to have a complete winter issue. You understand me, Colonel? And if he doesn't get it, I'll be after you." "Yes, sir," said the commander. "I'll take care of it myself." "You better, or you'll be doing something else tonight," Patton said. Then as he was leaving the office, he wheeled around dramatically. "You," he said, addressing the young soldier. "Son, if you try to hawk that ring, I'll have you court-martialed. And that's a direct order." "Yes, sir," said the soldier. Back downstairs, Chaplain Myers, and I've known him for years, Chaplain Myers asked, "Sir, can you really do that? Can you court-martial a soldier for that?" Patton shook his head. Myers, that's theater." "It was such a great moment," Myers said. "Looking back, I remember thinking, this guy's an actor." So that's my dad and a version of my grandfather side by side. And I guess the point of that story, which I like to tell, because I do think it rings true, is that the two of them were a lot alike. They were cut from the same cloth. No, not completely. There's some important differences. If I don't mention them, feel free to ask. And it's hardly surprising that they're similar. I mean, they're the same name. They ultimately ended up in the same branch of the military. But my father was literally immersed in things military growing up. I remember speaking with my grandfather's, I guess you would say his official biographer, a guy named Martin Blumenson. And he said, "You got to understand, your dad had cornflakes in military history for breakfast every morning." So the first thing I want to show you is a few clips of some home movie footage, mostly of my dad's era growing up with his dad. And I guess I can say this, though, that in the Patton family, we never threw anything out. And now maybe that's because my grandfather said, someday I'm going to be famous and I want to save all this stuff. Or it's just the way or they thought that anyone's history, as I feel, is important. And in fact, we still have the piece of shrapnel, artillery shrapnel, that pierced my great-great-grandfather's abdomen in September of 1864 in the Third Battle of Winchester, Virginia, as well as the shirt tail that it pierced. And so we don't throw anything out, but we have a lot of home movies, and they did record a lot of things. So this just gives you a little slice. Just light this thing up again. It'll hopefully reactivate. And a little slice of the world my dad grew up in, which is very similar to the world I grew up in. And so take a look at this. And you'll hear my father's voice. And let me just make one clarification. My grandfather, has anyone ever heard his voice actually? His actual voice? Yes, it's not George C. Scott. It's like, God damn, we're going to get those Germans, they're going to grease the treads of our tank. My dad, as you will hear, had very much the George C. Scott voice. And let me tell you, when I got my puffer kite stuck in a tree and I was late for curfew, when I was 6 or something, 6 p.m. from across the street, this is the voice I heard, so.
My name is Wicked Willie. I'm a terror, understand. I'm a pirate on the ocean and a robber on the land. That was a damn poem I had to memorize. This is Aberdeen, and they're looking at these tanks. And this is what used in World War I. They still have one working at Fort Knox. And I'm getting out of the tank. That's quite a picture.
This is about 1930, 36, 37. So, also keep in mind here in this clip, in the Patton family, the point of the exercise here was not the building of the boats, as you're about to see. I don't know how I came up with this music for this, quite honestly, but. This I love. This is 1939 outside of Fort 38 outside of Fort Myers actually, and you can see the old post office and the Washington Monument in the background. And he had made that chainmail. We still have that. So you could really say he was a method warrior, if you will. And that's my grandmother. So funny stuff, but really quite significant. We had a party one time where where my parents had a party for, I think, my dad's sister's birthday, and the theme was "Come as your favorite incarnation." So that's the kind of stuff we did in my house for fun. I came as the Great Waldo Pepper, even though I'm not even sure if he really existed. But anyway, so what's the book about? Growing Up Patton. It's about a number of things, but first off, it's about a complex relationship between a father and a son. And when as I started to pay attention to my grandfather's history, and as a kid, I preferred to pay attention to a lot of other things, but there was this sort of an oft criticism of my grandfather. He wasn't a very involved father. He was a bit of a prima donna and self-involved and narcissistic and all these things. Now, some of those may have been true, but he was I think he didn't get the credit he deserved for being a father. And the bottom line is, during my father's adolescence, my grandfather was away a lot. And between 1938 and 1945, when he died, they really didn't see very much of each other. And particularly between 1942 and 45, my father went to West Point in the summer of 42, and my grandfather came to visit when he was a plebe, just after he'd entered. And this was just before Operation Torch, which leads to the opening portion of the movie Patton. And they just spent a few hours together. And then he saw him once at the end of the war when he was with General Doolittle, on a Bond tour in Boston and LA, just for a couple of days. Then he went back to Germany and was in a freakish car accident where he was the only one injured and broke his neck and died 2 weeks later. And then he died 3 days before my dad's 22nd birthday in 1945. So what's interesting, though, is that they corresponded almost weekly by letter throughout this period. And I have a number of these letters reproduced in the book. And when I was researching the book, of course, the Patton Papers, which was put together by this Martin Blumenson I mentioned, it has most, if not all, the letters or excerpts of all the letters written from my grandfather to various people. Most, my father and my father's mom and other relatives. But you rarely see, even among the historians that were paying attention to my grandfather, you really see the other half of that correspondence. And so I thought I was curious to see the other half of that conversation. So you see this wonderful dialogue between father and son that's a combination of fatherly wisdom and kind of tactical talk. And here's just a quick example. This is actually the soft cover, which I don't know, I think they have some available today. This letter's in here, but not on the hardcover. But it says, well, see, they both flunked out of math. My grandfather flunked freshman year out of math, had to repeat. My dad also flunked out of West Point, had to repeat a year. So it says here, he's talking about, how this beautiful battle he watched and that kind of thing. And then he says now on math, he says, get as high a stand in math as you can before you hit the stuff you flunked on. In that way, you will have further to retreat. It's just like war in a delaying action. Meet the enemy as far out as possible. This is like January 1944. So, and my father would respond, in kind about how they weren't spending enough time on the Peninsular Campaign of Napoleon and all this kind of stuff, and how women kept him from studying and all these kind of things. But it was great. So I definitely commend that to you. But what's interesting, if you look at the timing, though, so they saw each other just twice during the war. Then my grandfather goes back, and then the day before he's supposed to come home on December 9th, he's in a freak car accident. No conspiracy, as far as anyone in our family has been led to believe, and we've investigated it. Just a drunken soldier in a truck that hit a car going 20 miles an hour, and he was just unlucky. He had great luck up until then, and he just had some bad luck that day. So he died 2 weeks later. My grandmother did not let my father come over to him when he was in the hospital to see him, because he was in the middle of exams, and then she didn't let him come to the funeral. I think partly because she wanted to have that time to herself with her husband. But so my father didn't see him. Then he turned 22 on Christmas Eve, and then 6 months later he graduates from West Point, and an old veteran comes up to him, reaches out his hand and said, "Son, you'll never be the man your father was, but congratulations anyway." So this happens on the first day of my father's military career, right? Imagine. So people think, did I go through a lot of pressure? Did I get pressured? Compared to what my father had to deal with, can't even compare. So, the book is really also about wisdom. It's about not only the relationship between a father and son, but the wisdom passed down through the generations. The longest letter in here is about, I think I did the math, it was about 1,000 words, and it was written on D-Day. And most of the quotes that are actually attributed to my grandfather came out of this letter. So it's in here, and it's a beautiful letter where he had some time on his hands. He didn't want to. And if you look at the little sailing footage, obviously he was fortunate to be able to, have a sailboat and sail across the Pacific, but he also taught himself how to celestial navigate and made a 2,300-mile journey from Los Angeles to Hawaii without radar or LORAN or anything like that. And so you can imagine on D-Day how upset he was that he wasn't involved, because he probably knew more about things nautical, certainly than anybody in the Army and possibly most people in the Navy. So whenever I go to Normandy, I see everybody's name but Patton. It's just amazing. And that must have really frustrated him. He did get his chance, obviously, as all of you know. But anyway, I always think this says a lot about my father. This incident at West Point in June of 1945. And despite those obstacles that he faced, the main one being a gigantic shadow that just loomed overhead for his entire career. He had the same name, went to the same branch of the military, but also the same area of the Army. He didn't actually even raid into tanks to begin with, but a couple of years later he got into tanks. And he had a lot of similar qualities, as I said. He emerged as a strong leader. He actually saw more frontline combat than his father did, just by the nature of the Vietnam War. And he was equally decorated for valor. I sometimes walk by this library in our home, and I look at the certificates of valor that he has there, and in one 8-week period, on 4 different occasions, he received 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, which are just below the Medal of Honor, a Silver Star, which is just below that, and a Purple Heart, while he was commanding a 4,000-man regiment. And as anybody knows, when you're commanding a large unit, you don't necessarily have to be in front. And in fact, typically he was in a helicopter, but he had 3 or 4 helicopters shot out from under him as well. His helicopter was named after Jackson's horse, Little Sorrel, and I think when he finished Vietnam, he was on Little Sorrel 5. But anyway, but he persevered, strong leader. You always see my grandfather in footage or in the movie Patton or any place where you'll see photographs of him. He's always moving forward through the troops, and this is by design. I mean, they were very effective and deliberate about using their personality, their persona, to move the ball forward. My father, the same quality. In fact, I got to benefit from that because obviously he spent a lot of his time as a commander in peacetime, and he commanded the 2nd Armored Division in the 1970s. I actually had my own radio handle. I thought it was super cool. I was 10, and he was Powerhouse 6 as commander of the 2nd Armored Division, which had also been commanded by his father prior to World War II. I think it's the only case where that's happened. So he was Powerhouse 6. I was Little 6. And my mom had a handle too, but she was 6 Whiskey. She's like, I don't even drink whiskey. Why do they have to call me 6 Whiskey? So I don't know what that is. But my father had that quality too. So he would wake me up at 6 in the morning or even earlier, and we would go to the dozen or so mess halls on Fort Hood, and he would drop in there. There was 2 stars, and they were white, and you'll find out in a couple minutes why they were white. And he would show up, and he's eating the same scrapple and sausage gravy and grits and eggs that everybody else is eating, and he would just drop in there, and they'd be scared to death at first, and the service, if not the food, got better in a hurry. But the more important thing, and I think anybody that's commanded troops, and there are a number of you in here, will appreciate that idea of that top-down loyalty, which is true of corporate America too, or should be, that when that CO shows up and he's eating the same stuff with the colonel, I'm sure you all will know this, but you're eating the same food as your men, they appreciate that. They appreciate that. And he did that all the time, and I got to join him for the ride. So he actually had a name for it. He called it visible personality, that ability to put yourself at the critical point in a battle or a peacetime situation to move the ball forward. And they both had that. They were all about mobility and readiness. I think my dad, and I don't know how long I can talk. I have these different tangents I get off on, I'm sorry, but my father actually had his own definition for readiness, and it was pretty clear. I heard him say this one time in a talk. He said, readiness is the professional, moral, spiritual, mental, and material capability to carry out the military objectives of the United States of America without fail, always and every time, probably against heavy odds, in the toughest of conditions of weather and terrain anywhere in the world. He knew that was his job. He loved soldiering. They were a lot alike. I think my grandfather, for those that adored him and liked him, they more revered him a little bit as a god, kind of this iconic figure, whereas my dad could have just as easily been a truck driver, an NCO driving a truck. They were both with the troops, but I think my father was able to sort of immerse himself in it a little more easily. They were both equal opportunity offenders to some extent, often on purpose. They had frequent brushes with authority. I'm sure that it shortened both of their careers. Certainly, it took my grandfather completely out of the planning of Normandy, the slapping incidents. There were 2 of them. And my father had a number of cases where he bucked authority. I heard of one. Again, it's a peacetime situation, but I met somebody from Bell Helicopter a few years ago, and he had worked in the division my dad had been in when he was, I think he was a colonel at that point, or a brigadier general. And there had been an incident where my dad, I think he was the assistant division commander, and my dad had promised kindergarten students in Germany that he would fly Santa Claus into the playground for Christmas. So then the order came down that you weren't allowed to do that anymore. My dad said, to hell with that, I promised these kids. So he had Santa Claus flying and he got written up for that. And there were some more severe examples of his bucking authority. But now I want to show you something. Again, I'm sure there probably aren't many people, if anyone, that knows of my father. He wasn't world famous, but he was very well known in the military, and he's probably one of the superior combat soldiers of his time, I would say. So when in 1977, he didn't know this, but it was really the height of his career. He was just finishing his command of the 2nd Armored Division, which, as I said, was the same division commanded by his father in 1940 or so, 41, before World War II. And my mother always says this is her favorite interview of him because and I hope you'll see this, but he's interviewed toward the end of his tenure, his term in Texas, and I was about 11. And so he's very much channeling his father, but I think you'll appreciate that at whatever this is, let's say 45 or so in this clip, he is very much his own man. There's a certain kind of confidence, deserved confidence, and I always love this about him. So let me just play this for you. And by the way, if anyone gets done with my talk before I do, you're free to leave. Bear with me around my technical crew here for 1 second. Talk amongst yourselves. Here we go. Okay, so this is just a short interview with an, let's just say, a rather unsuspecting female civilian reporter from Texas.
Why do you wear white stars instead of camouflage stars?
2 reasons. I'm glad you asked that. First, so that there's no problem with anyone recognizing who I am, and that if I don't get the proper salute after I give the proper salute, I've got a case where I can stop the Jeep and take corrective action. Second, to give the enemy a target to shoot at. In other words, if it goes, if we have a war, to flaunt myself in front of them and give them a target.
Now that shocks me.
I'm sure it would.
Did you intend it to?
No. I just believe generals should be seen.
But you're serious about giving the enemy a target?
Yes, that's right. I don't believe that we have certain people around here that won't wear their insignia in the field. And they're not in this division. Although I did run into one the other day who now wears his insignia. But I believe in letting them know I'm around.
Is your life not more valuable than all of that?
I suppose it's valuable. I rather I'm enjoying it, and we're a long time dead. But I happen to believe that I should set the example and be seen. I should not only be seen by the frontline soldier, but if I show the enemy these stars, that shows them that I have a certain disdain for their accuracy of fire, whoever they are, and I in fact do retain that disdain.
You're not
I don't think they're 9 feet tall.
You're not going against Army regulation in wearing the white stars.
I'm sure I am. But there are other people who wear funny things in their uniforms too that also go against regulation. Suffice it to say, no one has ever spoken to me about this.
Suffice it to say.
And I'll continue to wear them until I'm ordered to take them off.
So that's my dad. What do you think? Right? He's pretty cool. He's pretty cool, right? I mean, right? My grandfather's got nothing on him there, But they were very, very similar in a lot of ways, and I think in important ways. They both cared deeply about their soldiers, quite well known for that. In spite of the famous incident, my grandfather and my dad, I heard him all the time. Do you have dry socks? Do you have hot food on the front? The Third Army was famous for getting hot meals almost every day. They both visited a number of hospitals. My grandfather did not like it, and I think it was tough for both of them. But they visited a great number of them. When my father gave up command of the 11th Armored Cavalry Black Horse Regiment in 1969. He lost, I think it was close to 100 soldiers, or thereabouts. I forget the exact number, but he sat in he remembered every one of their names, wrote every one of their spouses, if they had one, or family, about the loss, and he sat in his helicopter and wept that day. And now we have a working organic commercial farm in Massachusetts, and every one of our fields is named after someone that passed away under his command. It just chokes me up just to think about it. But as you can see by now, I haven't made the point clear enough that my grandfather was a Titan in many people's eyes. My father was a Titan in my eyes. So, and yet there were areas where they fell short. And I think one of them. And by the way, I commend the book to you. Not like I'm trying to push copies here, but just that the stories. My father died in 2004 after a long bout with Parkinson's and related dementia, and what I was forced to do was go back, and although I knew him and hung out with him into my 30s, and we had a great time together, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the things that were really important. And as there's many sons and daughters of parents leave a lot on the table. I'm sure there's some in this room, where you wish you had that conversation you didn't have. And it's one of the reasons that a side business I have is working on recording families' personal biographies. So I went back after he died, and I reconnected with a number of people that I had known growing up. Everyone I write about in the book I knew. General Abrams, General Creighton Abrams, his sons. One of the more interesting chapters, I think, is about the son of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Well, his son was the mayor of Stuttgart for 22 years until he aged out. He was so popular. And he and my father met in the 50s and became great friends. The fathers, I think, had always wanted to meet, actually. And then the widows wanted to meet. None of that happened. And then my father in the 50s he was stationed in Stuttgart, where Manfred Rommel was a young bureaucrat who had grown up in the ashes of World War II. And they became great friends. And lo and behold, they discovered on their first meeting that they shared a birthday of Christmas Eve. So whenever we were stationed in Stuttgart, which was several times, we would go to the Rommel's house, and he became mayor in around 1974. So during two of our tours there, he was the mayor, the Oberbürgermeister. And so we would go over to their house, and it was something else to see them trade memorabilia and battle maps and things like that. And it was just to be a fly on the wall for that was just fascinating, these two sons of history. So there's a lot of that in there. But nonetheless, the two Georges shared something which perhaps their generations did too, and that's a complete, I would say, lack of understanding for one of the most horrific killers really right now in the military, which is post-traumatic stress and the related injury of traumatic brain injury. So I think it sounds self-aggrandizing to say this because I'm just a little small blip among the 40,000 nonprofits involved in the veterans area, but I do feel that my focus, which I'm going to talk about for the last few minutes, on post-traumatic stress and using filmmaking, which is my chosen profession, it does feel as though it's completing the circle. I mean, I was on my way to the Navy and I had second thoughts about it and kind of wrestled with it for about a decade, even after it was no longer an option. And then when I got to be in my 30s, I got into the world of production, and then I got to in my early 40s, and I discovered teaching and film, and then in the last 3 years, really alongside writing this book, I decided that I was interested in the idea of using film in the service of veterans and military families, and perhaps other populations as well, in their therapy and in their recovery. So, as I said, there were the famous incidents of my grandfather, and my father had a similar incident in Korea where someone left the front line. He pulled a gun on him and said, I'm going to have you tried for misbehavior before the enemy, for leaving your post. And I think he just did that to scare the guy going to go back into his position. I think the next day he had him transferred out. But there's a reason why the book is quite literally framed on the front end by a foreword by Bob Woodruff, who you may know is the ABC anchor who took over for Peter Jennings, that was then severely wounded in an IED explosion when he was embedded with an infantry division in Iraq. And on the front end, and on the back end, with talk about the work I'm doing with post-traumatic stress. So over the last 2 years, I started an initiative called I Was There, and where we basically take cameras and we go to warrior transition units, which are located on all the major Army bases in America. And the Army, of course, is taking the brunt of the casualties, at least the active duty deployed casualties in the military right now. And we hold multi-day filmmaking workshops for any veteran, but primarily for the veterans that are being treated at these warrior transition units, which are units that are created and designed to allow these soldiers to get the help they need. And just to give you a sense for the civilians out there that don't understand, I know we all have a broad understanding of the suicide statistics, and they're pretty frightening, but just to give you a sense for those of you that don't know, and these are broad, the information is never completely current, but there's been well over 2 million people deployed in these last two wars, Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, and to Iraq and Afghanistan. About 20% of them come back with diagnosed or undiagnosed post-traumatic stress, but certainly with clinically, if it was diagnosed, they're thought to have it. About a quarter of them come back with some level of traumatic brain injury, and a lot of those are those football-type injuries, which are concussions, which can really severely inhibit you. They often come together, the two injuries too, and right now we're seeing a suicide rate. Again, my statistics are about 6 months old now, although I think they're increasing. about 1.3 of the veterans of the current two wars suicides every day. But that pales in comparison to the overall suicide statistic, which again is about 6 months old, but it's almost 1 an hour among all veterans. So if you do the math, people say, oh, are you really focused? I think, was it Ann or Tracy asked me, who were both at the school of Clinton School of Public Service, asked me if we mainly focus on the current veterans or the older veterans. Well, I'd say the majority of the people in our workshops are current veterans, but the ones I'm also got my eye on are the Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans, because if you do the math, I mean, well over 50% of those suicides are happening among Vietnam veterans. And so those are the people that put layers and layers of paint over the issue. Perhaps like even my father. I remember when I first came out with this book last year, someone in the audience asked me, do you think, it was actually my brother, my older brother, who put me in a really, I didn't have an answer for this question, but he said, do you think our dad suffered from post-traumatic stress? And I've grown to think about it, and there were several cases where at least he exhibited a longing for his soldiers or some hallucinations that might have suggested it, that even the great Generals Patton may have had it. So, and then I met a Medal of Honor recipient, a guy named Roger Donlin recently, a Vietnam Special Forces guy, at a dinner, and he said, don't kid yourself. He says, we all have it, it's just a matter of degrees. So there's that, you know. But anyway, so we, I mean, even on its best day, even on its most efficient day, the VA is utterly overwhelmed by this. I mean, there could be, if you do the math on the numbers of TBI and PTS sufferers, it could be 750, 800,000. And that's a lot. And those are the ones that are even from these wars. So, so far we've done these 4-day workshops at Fort Carson, Fort Belvoir, Fort Bragg. It helps to have now recently had a 3-star general who's the Corps Commander at Fort Bragg join my advisory board, because let me tell you, the seats get filled at Fort Bragg when we do these workshops. We've produced about 80 films with 150 soldiers. We started, and I use the term soldiers brought loosely. All services are invited. We've had military sexual trauma or rape survivors come. We've had spouses. We've started inviting spouses. It's been pretty powerful, and I guess if you sort of think logically, it hasn't been approved as a treatment yet, but if you, or anybody that's done any sort of counseling or therapy, it's very clear that cognitive therapy and keeping a diary and telling your story and sharing your story are all valuable. When I get stressed out, what do? I pick up the phone and call my best friend. So it stands to reason that just taking a pencil out of your hand and putting a camera in it offers an even more robust and multimodal, multisensory medium. And I'm looking at Susan Elder, who's known me for a year, and she's nodding because she agrees. So it's obvious that this is a valuable tool. And this is the tool of this generation. This is the YouTube, Facebook, MySpace, Instagram generation. And so this is the tool they communicate with more than writing. My father, I mean, it even evolved within the book. My grandfather corresponded every week with my dad and other people. My dad and my mother in Vietnam, they corresponded by audio tape, and most of those are reproduced in the book as well. So the medium changed, but the desire to communicate, in fact, I think it's really actually inherent, intrinsic to what it is to be human, to that deep need to share your story, to be remembered, to create some level of community with others in that way. You can look at the caves of Chauvet from southern France, that they made Werner Herzog, the man who made Grizzly Man, made a wonderful film called Cave of Forgotten Dreams. And they uncovered these caves, have you seen it? They uncovered these caves in the mid-90s, and they're these vast caverns that nobody lived in. They just came there specifically to draw with charcoal and other things on the walls, scenes of their lives, basically saying, I killed a deer today, I fed my family, I existed, I was here, I mattered. And so it goes back a long way to I think, this idea of narrative and the importance of it in the life of a human being. So we're just building on that. And we've had some great success recently. And I've just gotten a grant from the Wounded Warrior Project, and in November, last week we did a workshop in a rare situation. I allowed some press there, and we had Lee Woodruff, who's a host of CBS This Morning, come and bring your crew, and a couple of soldiers allowed themselves to be interviewed, and it was quite extraordinary. So that'll be on Veterans Day on national television, I think. So what I want to show you, though, is there are two parts to this. One is the films they make, and one is the process that they go through in making a film. And I only have time to show you one, so I'm going to show you a film. And it was actually made by two soldiers, but it was the story of one. Now, a soldier doesn't have to come to this workshop to spill their guts on the table and reveal everything about themselves. It could be fictional, it could be claymation, it could be a music video, it could be anything. But what happens is they end up revealing something of themselves through these films. Whether they make it with a spouse or they make it with 3 other soldiers, it usually is something that enables them to unlock something that they've been thinking about and maybe they haven't talked about ever. And our belief is that maybe, just maybe, they can make a film about it, even if they can't talk about it. And before I show the clip, I'll just say to keep in mind the 3 things that we focus on, which I think the further we go down the road are ring more and more true, is the idea of listening, collaborating, and empowering. We listen to them. I surround them with filmmakers like myself and other civilians that have no previous connection to veterans in many cases, but it begins to prove to them that other people, that it's really more about the way you listen and that you care, not so much that you've been through the same experience that matters. We've all had traumas in our life. Very few of them compare to being in combat, but they feel the same, whether it's a broken marriage or prone to anxiety or loss of a loved one, all these kinds of things. And the collaborate is probably the central element to the whole thing, is the idea that, as I said, getting back to Werner Herzog, but the idea of immersing yourself in a situation where you're making a film with somebody else and you feel like at the beginning you think nobody can understand my story. By the end of it, you've collaborated with 1 or 2 or 3 other soldiers, maybe a military spouse and a couple of civilian filmmakers, and you're like, wow, that's what I wanted to say. And in this case of the film I'm going to show you, by an NCO named Bryce Shepard, who's an OIF veteran with 4 or 5 deployments, has a broken back. In fact, the only time he sat down the entire week was in the first shot of this film. This is an effective thing for them, and it's a way for them to communicate something. So I want to give you a quick example of this, and then I'll close up and answer any questions about what we're up to. Sound good? Nobody's asleep yet? Okay. Yeah, this was made in February, and yes, there's a little slate on here which gives you some context. Here you go. There's a little combat footage. Just to say, the combat footage in here came from this guy's helmet camera. He wore a GoPro, which is a remote camera that a lot of these soldiers, the teched out soldiers, wear. And so 2 soldiers made it, but the footage is all his own footage and his voice. We made this in about 12 hours.
Hello? Yeah, I can stop and pick some stuff up, babe. Yeah, I'm at the commissary already. Alright, love you, and I'll see you in a little bit. Bye.
Dude.
Anybody in? Anybody hit? Are you okay? We're good. Are you good? Come up here.
got my family.
So that's just one example, perhaps almost a stereotypical or archetypal example of this, what happens, but they're very, very different. And did anybody notice anything in particular? But did you notice the wardrobe at the end, how he changed into a civilian outfit? Yeah, and also there was a thank you to another soldier. A lot of times there'll be 3 or 4 working together, but the other soldier that he thanked is the guy that was actually doing we call POV shots, where the camera's on his chest. He was doing that inside because Bryce didn't want to be inside the supermarket. So he had another soldier do that. So, and we always ask them 2 questions. We ask them, who's your audience, and what are you trying to communicate to that audience? And he said, my audience is my wife or my fiance and her son and my son. They were both from previous marriages. And he said, what I want to communicate are 2 things in this case. He said, I want them to know that, 1, they have no idea what I go through every time I go shopping at the commissary. And secondly, that despite that ignorance, that they are my lifeline. And I think he gets both of those across. And when I went back there, we try to do them on a regular basis if we can get the funding at each location, so that we can build some continuity, so that the soldiers can come back that are still at the WTU and contribute as mentors. And I remember seeing them when they came back for a future workshop, and I saw his wife, and I said, what'd you think of the movie? And she goes, I had no idea. And it's particularly when you're from a military family, at least it still surprises me, that they just don't want to share it. So that's what we're doing. I mean, I said the book is about wisdom. I think the 2 pieces of advice that were most important to me, other than don't say you know and shut the hell up from my dad, were be yourself. If you're not yourself, you're nobody. And he said, and I think that's something he struggled with quite a lot. And the other thing was from Ecclesiastes. As I said, we kept everything and we quoted from whatever works, whether it's from the Quran or from the Bible or from Kipling or anywhere in between. If it worked, somebody from the Patton family used it to quoted it. And from Ecclesiastes, my dad used to always say this to me, and now I can never forget it, is, whatsoever your hand findeth itself to do, do it with thy might. And that's what he did, and that's what I'm doing here. And, I just want to leave you this idea that earlier, I do often say this, that I think it's important to thank our veterans, but it isn't enough. In fact, it's almost a negative if you thank the veterans. In fact, my mother just called me yesterday and told me about a book that I've got to read called Thank You for Your Service, which is all about that point. That going up and saying thank you to the soldier is one thing, but it almost leaves a hole if you then walk away and forget about them. If you're going to go up to somebody in the airport, go up and introduce yourself and share a little bit of your own history if you're connected with the military, or ask them a question, My mother actually, I probably need to close up here in a second, but in the 50s, my father was off in Vietnam, and my mother had married into this famous family, and she got tired of having to answer, because you can imagine the Patton legacy was very fresh at this point. And here she is married to Mrs. George S. Patton, so people were like, oh, are you related? And there got to be a point where I forget where they were living, maybe at Fort Hood, and she, because they were stationed there a couple times, and she said no one time, and a guy a soldier that knew my mom was behind her, and he came up to her and said, Joanne, he said, you can't just say that. She said, well, I'm just tired of answering this question. He says, yeah, but you realize a lot of these people that come up to you are recent World War II veterans, and they may have buried this stuff for the last decade that they've gone through, and you're taking away an opportunity for them to share something and reconnect with their own history. And so my mother instructed us basically as kids, when people said, oh, are you related to General Patton or something, I would say, yes, did you know him? And then you just be quiet and you wait for the story. And that story is as helpful to them as it is to you. So I would just say that it's not enough to just say thank you. And you've got to get involved. And part of what we're doing is trying to create this model at the military bases, because that's really the point of the Spirit. That's where this stuff is happening. But of course, this can be valuable to a rape survivor, I live in New York, to a 9/11 first responders say, or my family's from Boston, to a marathon survivor. A person that I'm hoping to invite to another workshop is an FBI field agent that was picking up pieces of people, the minutes after the marathon. And so could this be valuable to them? Of course. And I just want to remind everybody, and I think this is an audience that knows this, but I love to speak about these things. I'm excited about what I'm doing. I think I am joining my my vocation with my avocation, as my father often instructed me to do. But that I often get asked to speak, and a lot of members of my family, on Veterans Day, on Memorial Day, on D-Day, days like that. And it's kind of like, and I think that's wonderful, but it sort of reminds me of the Mother's Day quandary that we all find ourselves in. A lot of us find ourselves in at 10 o'clock on Mother's Day, where it's like, I forgot to send my mom flowers. Now it's too late. She's not going to get the letter till Tuesday. Blah, 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 blah. And then you have to remind yourself, no, the point of Mother's Day isn't to just so that you remember your mother just that one day. And likewise, the point of these holidays, they're just signposts. They're not reminders. They're not the days when the only days we're supposed to remember these veterans and these heroes and their families, just as importantly. They're really a reminder that we need to be thinking about them every day. I mean, every day. And so we're trying to do that, and hopefully we can scale this program up so that we can push this curriculum out to places like here. Wouldn't I love to come back to Little Rock, get some corporate support, and throw a workshop here, maybe with a different audience, right? I'm still sort of a necessary piece of it, but I think more and more, once they get hooked in, right, that first, sometimes it happens in 15 minutes, and they go, oh, then the rest is automatic. And so anyway, maybe we'll find some people to take that journey with us today, but thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we got time for some questions. Great, thanks, Dan. Great
How
job.
was that, Nikolai? Good. He's the guy I've got to really answer to,
Well, you got a thumbs up from Nick. That's pretty good. All right, Don.
Benjamin, I'm moved by your presentation today, and I'm for a couple of reasons. My son suffers from PTSD. He's not a soldier. In the 10th grade, he was brutally attacked at his high school in the Bay Area. And we struggle with it every day. What I want to say is that what you've given me today, and pardon my emotion, is some agency to help him in ways that I didn't think about it. And so I say thank you to that. And I've got a lot of work to do, and I'm just moved by that. There's another thing you said, a couple of things that were powerful for me. One was there are 40,000 vet nonprofit groups that are working to aid and assist our veterans. And there's something about that that's fantastic and wonderful, but then I think, are we doing enough as a society? We live in a time when we have this discourse in our political system about austerity, when in fact I'm not so sure that's the right way to go. And we ought to be creating support that, frankly, it seems to me, eliminates the need for those 40,000 nonprofits to take care of our veterans. I know that's an impossible thing, so I want to make that point. I guess the third thing I want to say is that you concluded with this, and I just want to, I guess, echo some praise for that. And that is that what you've shared with us is not just important for the soldiers, it's important for our society to take a step back and to recognize that what we have to do every day is to make sure that we don't get in wars that don't matter. That the cost of that is too great for our treasures, our young people. So I just want to look forward, and I teach here part-time at the Clinton School, and I would very much like an opportunity, because I think one of the things I want to do is go get my son one of those cameras and start figuring out a way for him to sort of deal with his own issues in this way. So I just want to say again, thank you, and I look forward to whatever we can do, maybe Dean, to really see that if we can carry this forward. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. And your son lives in the Bay Area now, or is he? Okay. But, well, first of all, more and more I'm opening these things up. Again, we've only done 8 or 9 of them, so we haven't scaled it yet, but we're going to, every time now we're going back to return bases. I'm just going like for the first day, and I've trained about 6 people to sort of do the rest of it. And so that's the first step towards scaling this up. And as we get more support and more people involved, and probably the CBS piece will help a lot, we'll see more of that. And as far as so I would like to expand. I just started opening up to spouses and siblings, because of course they deal with it every day. And the films that have come out of these things, the handful of films, and a couple of you in here have seen them, have come out of created by a spouse and her husband, or a spouse and his whether it's a male or female, but a military couple is incredible. And as far as the 40,000 NGOs, I don't really have a good answer for that, except I guess the point I'm more focused on is that people are going to start their initiatives, but the thing that we need is for them to work together. And so what's interesting, what I hope is interesting about what we're doing, or unique about what we're doing, is that we could probably, the medium we're working in allows us to collaborate with almost all the other ones. What's fly fishing? I could teach people to make promo videos about healing waters. That's a fly fishing initiative, and so I think that's what we want to see. So we're starting to collaborate with the Wounded Warrior Project, hopefully the Bob Woodruff Foundation. We may partner up with an Israeli research organization that focuses, that's treated 160,000 soldiers with post-traumatic stress. And what we're doing now, thanks to the money we got from the Wounded Warrior Project and other groups, is build a website where these soldiers can at least have some level of virtual community. Because what you worry about is that, what I worry about now is the idea of we've engaged them for a week, and they go back, and then they go back into their hole, and a month later. And that's the part, once you reach their hand out to hold the hand, you can't let them go.
Questions? Maggie, right here.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. This was really interesting. The last short film you showed was very artistic and well done and had a really good filmmaking feel. I was wondering how hands-off or hands-on the workshops are. I work on a much smaller scale with film and therapy, and sometimes I struggle with how much film skill they need to know, or how to use the camera or technique, but with also it being their own project and their own ideas.
It's tricky. It depends to a great extent on the capability, the interest of the participant. If you have 4 people participating in one film, which we always want at least 2 to work together. Every once in a while you have somebody that just has such a specific vision that they just don't really match up with anyone else, but we really try and get away from that. But if you have 3 or 4 people, invariably they come up with different skill sets. One's particularly interested in the technical, one's interested in story, one wants to be in front of the camera, that kind of thing. In this case, he was a little bit less hands-on, but the other guy was wearing a GoPro, and they both help with editing. So we're more focused on this particular workshop. We might come up with other versions of it, or secondary workshops or advanced workshops. This particular one, the focus is on narrative. So what we want them to understand is their story. If we run out of time, we also want them to finish a film. So if we're pushing more of the buttons at the end, so be it. But there are people that just come in there. Some people bring in their own equipment. And so it really is a sliding scale, but everywhere at every turn, we try to push it back to them to say, tell us your story, and however technically involved you want to be. A Vietnam vet who's like 70 may not be particularly interested in learning Final Cut Pro, but he does have a story, and that's where it defaults to. And so again, I think it's a case-by-case thing, but you always want to lean toward empowering them, which is right here on my little wristband, at every turn. So you can do that in different levels and in different ways with different people.
Well, I know there may be more questions, but I also know people want to have a personal visit with Benjamin, and as well as buy copies of his book, Growing Up Patton, which will make a great gift for someone who has a family member who has been or is in the military. Let's thank Ben Patton very much.